This presentation reflects on a 15-minute episodic Key Stage 3 PE lesson focused on developing decision making through modified games. This session was aligned with the English National Curriculum for Physical Education, particularly the expectation that pupils use a range of tactics and strategies to overcome opponents in a competitive context and to analyse performance so they can improve over time. Although the session took place in a game setting, the broader aim was to develop decision making as a transferable skill relevant beyond PE. In this presentation, I will reflect on how the lesson was delivered, evaluate the pedagogical choices made in response to contextual constraints, and identify how my future practice could be improved. The lesson was structured around a series of modified games designed to progressively increase the cognitive demands of decision making across the session. The warm-up activity, Pac-Man, focused on spatial awareness and route selection, requiring students to constantly scan their environment and select safe pathways under light pressure. This helped introduce the session focus in a simple and accessible way. The session then progressed into noughts and crosses, which shifted decision making into a team-based context. Students were required to communicate, plan collaboratively, and consider both attacking and defensive decisions in order to achieve success. This was then followed by Rob the Nest, where the complexity of decision making increased further through the introduction of multiple variables. Pupils had to decide which equipment to prioritise, when to collect or defend resources, and how to adapt to their strategy in response to opponents. A final 1, 3 and 5 point game was planned to extend tactical prioritisation and competitive decision making. However, due to the constraints of the 15-minute episodic lesson format, this activity was not delivered. As a result, the lesson concluded with Rob the Nest. Although the lesson was originally planned to be delivered through guided discovery, time constraints led to a more instructional approach being adopted to ensure clarity, organisation, and progression between activities. Brief questioning between games was still used to encourage pupils to reflect on the decisions they were making. The lesson was designed with decision making as the central learning focus, based on the idea that physical education should support pupils to engage with complex, dynamic situations rather than simply reproduce isolated techniques. Games-based activities were therefore selected to create authentic contexts in which pupils were required to perceive information, make decisions, and act collaboratively. This approach aligns with broader arguments about the educational purpose of physical education, which suggests that PE should move beyond narrow performance outcomes and instead support meaningful learning experiences that are transferable beyond sport. Kirk critiques traditional PE as sport models and highlights the need for PE curricula that prioritise meaningful learning experiences, which inform the decision to emphasise decision-making within modified games rather than focus solely on isolated technique. Pedagogically, the session was originally planned to be delivered through guided discovery, drawing on constructivist principles where understanding is developed through interaction, problem-solving and reflection. Student-centred models in PE highlight the value of this approach in promoting autonomy and deeper engagement with learning tasks. However, due to the constraints of delivering a 15-minute episodic lesson, a more instructional teaching style was adopted in practice. Within Mostyn and Ashworth's teaching style spectrum, instructional approaches can be appropriate where clarity, structure and efficiency are required, particularly in time-limited contexts. This decision was made to ensure tasks were understood quickly and that progression between activities could be maintained. Despite this shift away from guided discovery, the lesson design still aligned with games-based learning principles. Modified games were used to emphasise tactical problems so that decision-making remained the primary learning outcome within representative situations. Overall, the approach attempted to balance learner-centred intentions with the practical constraints of an episodic PE lesson. This slide critically analyses the strengths and limitations of the pedagogical approach adopted during the lesson, with particular attention to inclusion, learner voice, and the use of competition. This analysis directly responds to formative feedback, which highlighted the need to move beyond implicit intentions and more critically examine how pedagogical choices shaped pupils' learning experiences. One key strength of the session was the emphasis on decision making rather than technical skill execution. Through the use of modified games, the lesson reduced the dominance of a sport-specific technique and enabled pupils to contribute in multiple ways, such as through communication, spatial awareness, and tactical positioning. This aligns with broader arguments that physical education should prioritise meaningful learning experiences rather than narrowly defined performance outcomes. In this sense, decision-making functioned as a more inclusive learning focus, as success was not solely dependent on physical proficiency. Modified games also supported participation by enabling varied roles within team-based activities. From a curriculum perspective, this reflects an attempt to broaden what is valued in PE rather than privileging a narrow set of abilities. Penny et al. Describes curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment as interconnected message systems, suggesting that what teachers design and emphasize communicates powerful messages about who PE is for. In this lesson, modified games communicated that thinking, cooperation, and decision-making were valued forms of participation. However, despite these strengths, inclusion within the session was largely implicit rather than explicit. Although adaptations were planned and the session was intended to be inclusive, these were not consistently discussed with pupils or actively constructed. Hageley refers to this as the inclusion illusion, where activities appear inclusive on the surface but may not result in meaningful inclusion for all learners. In this lesson, while pupils were physically present and engaged, some may have had limited influence over decision-making processes or task outcomes, particularly those with lower confidence or perceived ability. This highlights a limitation of assuming that task design alone only ensures inclusion. Research into inclusive PE emphasises the importance of reflexivity, where teachers critically examine how their assumptions and practices shape pupil experiences. In this lesson, greater opportunities for pupil voice, choice, and negotiation may have supported more meaningful inclusion. A further limitation related to the predominantly instructional teaching style adopted during delivery. While instructional delivery supported clarity, organisation, and efficient transitions within a 15-minute episodic lesson, it also positioned the teacher as the primary decision maker. From a critical pedagogical perspective, Stirrup and Hooper argue that PE should move beyond transmission models of teaching to create spaces for dialogue and shared meaning making. In this lesson, instructional delivery limited opportunities for pupils to influence task design or success criteria, potentially constraining deeper engagement with decision making. The use of competition also warrants critical examination. While competition increased engagement for some pupils, research suggests that it can legitimise certain forms of ability while marginalising others if success is narrowly defined. Without explicit framing around mastery, effort, or collaboration, competition may reinforce hierarchies of confidence and perceived competence. Motivation theory further supports this critique. Self-determination theory highlights the importance of autonomy, competence, and relatedness in sustaining motivation. While the lesson supported relatedness through teamwork, autonomy was limited by instructional delivery, and perceptions of competence may have been uneven due to competitive framing. This reinforces the need to deliberately design for both motivation and inclusion. Overall, this analysis demonstrates that while the lesson had clear strengths in terms of engagement, structure, and the prioritization of decision-making, it also revealed important limitations. Inclusion, learner voice, and the framing of competition require more intentional and reflexive pedagogical strategies. Recognizing these limitations is not a weakness, but a crucial step in developing more equitable and meaningful PE practice. This reflection has highlighted several clear actions that will inform my future practice in physical education, particularly in relation to inclusion, learner voice, and the use of competition. Firstly, inclusion needs to be made more explicit rather than assumed. While the session was designed with inclusive intentions, future lessons would actively involve pupils in discussing and co-constructing task adaptations, roles, and success criteria. Research highlights that meaningful inclusion requires intentional pedagogical strategies rather than surface level participation, which reinforces the importance of making inclusive practice visible and shared with learners. Secondly, increasing learner voice will be a key focus. Although instructional delivery supported clarity within an episodic lesson, future sessions would embed more opportunities for pupil dialogue and shared decision making, such as allowing pupils to adapt rules or propose tactical solutions. Critical pedagogical perspectives emphasise the importance of pupil agency and shared meaning making in physical education, which supports deeper engagement with learning. Thirdly, competition will be more deliberately framed to support motivation and inclusion. Rather than emphasising winning, future lessons would prioritise mastery-orientated outcomes such as quality of decision making, teamwork, and effort. Motivation research suggests that supporting autonomy, competence, and relatedness is central to sustained engagement, and reframing competition in this way can reduce the risk of marginalising less confident pupils. Finally, this reflection has reinforced the value of designing fewer activities with greater depth. Future episodic lessons would spend longer on fewer tasks, allowing more time for questioning, reflection, and pupil-led adaptation. This would better align pedagogical intentions with practice and support more meaningful learning experiences. Overall, these actions demonstrate how critical reflection on practice can directly inform more inclusive, learner-centered, and educationally meaningful physical education in the future.